Hello, and welcome to Radio Free Acton, the podcast of the Acton Institute, dedicated to the study of religion and liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts. And on this episode, Jordan Baller, Director of Publishing here at Acton, speaks with Hunter Baker, one of Acton's affiliate scholars, about the topic of Hunter's upcoming lecture event on the need for Christian statesmanship. Hunter and Jordan will be discussing the attributes of a statesman and why we need Christian statesmen, especially in our political climate. This event will take place at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan on November 15, and you can register at acton.org/events. After that, host Bruce Walker speaks with George Nash, an American historian and interpreter of American conservatism. They'll be talking about the 70th anniversary of Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences. I want to give a shout out to the Twitter user IdeasHC, who suggested the topic of this segment. If you also have topics you'd like to hear covered on Radio Free Acton, tweet us at Acton Institute.
My name is Jordan Baller, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the Acton Institute. And it's my pleasure to talk with Hunter Baker, Dean of Arts and Sciences at Union University and an affiliate scholar here at the Acton Institute, ahead of his talk later this month on the need for Christian statesmanship. That'll be in the noon hour on November 15th. Hunter, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So the title is intriguing. There's obviously a need of some kind we have politically, if not many. Can you help us understand what you mean by Christian statesmanship?
Yeah, I really think that the idea of statesmanship has been lost to some degree, particularly in our domestic politics. I think that now, if you were to ask the question, who is a statesman or who is statesman-like, I think that you would typically think of somebody who is heavily involved in foreign affairs, right? You would look at somebody's foreign policy. I think that we have sort of confined the notion of statesmanship to that sort of activity. But if we were to look back and we were to kind of ask the question, what is a statesman, right? And if we were thinking about, say, ancient political thought, and maybe we were thinking about Plato or Cicero or Augustine or somebody like that, the statesman is not simply someone who is engaged in this diplomatic activity between nations, but rather the statesman is a person who, maybe we can use that word diplomatic again, but who is diplomatic within the society in which they live, right? So they are a person who seeks to reconcile the different interests in the broader society to each other. That is a critical part of the job of the statesman. And, sort of in fact, one of the lines that Cicero uses, and I know that Augustine repeats it at some point in the City of God, is this idea of the person who can sort of gather the discordant notes in a society and find some way to bring harmony forth out of them. I just think that we really rarely talk about that or think about that. I think that we tend to think of a political leader as having a base with whom they have to work, maybe even to pander, and then doing some modest reaching into the middle for support. But we kind of think about that, well, can they just sort of get that 50% support, that 50% plus one adequate to govern? And I think in terms of an ideal of statesmanship, that's really inadequate.
Well, there's a lot there in that answer. Thanks very much for that, Hunter. You raised the language of broader interests already, and that's one of the things I think about immediately when I think of a statesman or statesmanship is precisely what you pointed to, this contrast between what you might think of as self-interest or special interests as opposed to the public interest. And so that raises the question then, the pragmatic question, which you also already alluded to, is whether statesmen can get elected in this kind of a political environment, certainly that we have today. Is that a realistic kind of thing? Is it an ideal that we should strive for? But there are, what are the practical political realities that are obstacles to statesmanship today?
Yeah, we have some structural problems that stand in the way of statesmanship. So take, for instance, the fact that we have these primaries, right? We have primary elections prior to a general election. So in the primary election, you're trying to win the support of just Republicans or just Democrats. And in that sort of scenario, you are encouraged to run to either the right or the left in an attempt to win the primary, or maybe even to scare off potential challengers. Sometimes if a politician is seen as not being partisan enough, then that actually encourages primary challengers, right, to come in and run off to the left or right of them and potentially unseat them. And, during the last maybe 10 to 12 years, we've actually seen a lot of that happening. So the mere fact that we have primary elections sort of mitigates against statesmanship. Of course, the other thing is that we have sort of the winner-take-all election in the general, which, again, kind of leads you toward, I just have to get enough to win, right? And then I can kind of forget about the rest. The European proportional system, I think, probably at least has the potential to do better in terms of electing statesmen. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it seems like that those influences could perhaps more readily result in a statesman. What it would really take in the United States is for such a person to be able to win the support of their personality with a very kind of winsome personality, and somehow convince their own coalition that this statesman-like attitude is the right attitude, not only for their party but the whole country. Jordan, I know that you have studied Kuyper a lot more than I have. But I think of Kuyper, at least in terms of his prescriptions. I have less knowledge about the way he governed, but at least in terms of his prescriptions, I think of Kuyper as somebody who very much stood for this kind of statesman-like approach, right? So, for instance, it seems to me like he was very committed to finding a way to draw forth harmony from different economic interests.
Yes, and confessional and other forms of identity kinds of interests. This is a kind of what's now called a principled form of pluralism that is that's principled in your own convictions and your own identity and your own community's ideals, but also on a principled level is not just open to, but actually in some degree celebrates the diversity that we have in the modern world. Hunter, you had the opportunity to join auspicious ranks of people like Ben Sasse and Paul Henry, David Bratt, and America's President Jed Bartlett in your attempt to run for political office while occupying a university professorship. So I wonder, what did you learn? Could you talk a little bit about what you learned during your campaign? Could you tell us a little bit of details, what you were running for? The one thing that hasn't come up yet is money. When we think of statesmanship versus politicians,
yes,
and the possibility for enrichment of yourself or your constituents. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you learned practically in running for office.
Yes, I learned so much about money. I did know. Now, first of all, there's a sense in which my run for Congress was a little bit like the Blues Brothers. I know that's now a dated reference, but the Blues Brothers were on a mission from God, right? And that's kind of how I felt. I felt like God was calling me specifically to run for that seat and to make my primary point of emphasis religious liberty. Now, in a sense, that was not a very practical thing to do. I think that most people recognize that financial issues, the economy, that's sort of a dominant part of a platform. And I was really not running on that. I was running on religious liberty and because of the primacy of the issue, also on the sanctity of human life. And I emphasize those things over and over again. To the extent that I was able to get in front of people, I think I always did well. So, for instance, at a lot of events, they will have straw polls. Now, that's interesting in and of itself because I think that people hold straw polls so they can get candidates to bring supporters and pay for supporters to attend events. So straw polls in and of themselves are sort of a revenue-raising instrument. But I found that every time I attended something with a straw poll, I could finish much higher, maybe third or fourth, instead of sixth or seventh, where I finished in the general election. So a lot of that is, do you have the money? The money works two ways. I mean, one is it works in sort of a brute force way, because you can just literally pay for advertising and attention. But the other thing is that it seems like almost everybody in the journalistic side decides whether or not they're going to pay attention to you based on the money. And I thought that was really wrong. I mean, I understand why they do it. I mean, they're using kind of shortcuts the same way the rest of us do. But it struck me, now I'm not Socrates, right? But let's just pretend that Socrates would be the greatest member of any parliamentary body in the world. I don't know if that's really true, but let's pretend that he would, just by virtue of his knowledge, his wisdom, his ability to examine all different sides of an issue and to help other people to examine different sides of an issue. If Socrates ran for Congress and he did not have $1 million, nobody would pay any attention to Socrates. I would argue that points to a pretty significant flaw in our political system.
Yeah, so the skills you need to win an election are not the same set of skills that you need to be a statesman once elected.
Exactly. Yes.
And the election cycle has a lot to do with that, as well as our media culture and the discourse there.
Yes, that too. Now, the American founders, one thing they did that was pretty brilliant, not so much in terms of fostering statesmanship, but in terms of blunting the force of faction, is that we do have we have this amazingly staggered system of elections, so that people are not necessarily in office at the same time. There are many elections constantly being held. It's very hard to hold together a particular group of people over a long period of time. And that was all done by design. I mean, I tell students that I think that the U.S. government was kind of like an engine with sand purposely poured in between the gears instead of oil.
Or there's a certain amount of churn that's built into the system.
It is designed to be difficult to sustain a strong ideological direction in a particular way over time. You're constantly having to attend to the cultivation of support and maintaining office. Now, in some ways, that's a feature. In some ways, that's a bug.
Well, Hunter, ahead of your talk here in a couple of weeks, I wonder if you could just take a few minutes and say something about the Christian part. We spent a lot of time on the statesmanship part. Where do statesmen come from? If the political process itself is not designed to encourage it, given what we've talked about in terms of the incentives for getting elected and so on, what are some of the structures of society that may be fertile ground for growing statesmanship and strong senses of civil commitment? And what might it say about those things that we don't have we have a dearth, you could say, of statesmanship, of statesmen?
Yes.
These days?
Well, I mean, I think that in an increasingly postmodern world, I think that the primary currency of everything will tend to be power. Power and statesmanship do not necessarily travel together. I mean, it's very good for a statesman to have power. But whether a statesman can gain power is another question. But let's address the Christian part. We are, because of social media, because of increasing segmentation of the population, because of incredible powers of confirmation of biases and tribalism that we did not have before, we are more and more broken up into camps, and with a sharper and sharper sense of where we are within those camps and who we're for and who we're against. My argument is that as Christians, now it's true that as Christians we do end up being kind of in a part of a political coalition, and there are reasons for that. Simply being pro-life commits you more to one party than the other. And the way you view secularism and the operation of church state, that can also commit you to a particular party over the other one. But that having been said, Christians should certainly have this sense of being more than the member of a camp, right? I mean, Christians should all have this powerful sense of the brotherhood and the sisterhood of men and women under the fatherhood of God. And if you are seeing things that way, kind of in that sort of holistic, connected way, then you should shy away from that impulse of, I want to defeat them, right? I want to win over them. To use the language I sometimes hear, I want to feast on the delicious tears of my opponents. That should all be kind of foreign to you as a Christian. You should have this better sense that I wish we could be reconciled. I wish that we could find a way to love each other better, to bring about to somehow find a way to extend our love of neighbor into the way we deal with each other politically. There's a sense in which advocacy can become unjust, and often is unjust. And someone with a statesman-like instinct would shy away from that. And they would try to always do justice to the other person, to always be charitable to their point of view, to always represent their point of view in a way that they could accept. A Christian should want to do those things. Those are loving things to do and loving ways to treat people. And so the church should have kind of an advantage in bringing statesmen forth. Whether we have or not is another question, but there should be to some extent a natural seedbed for statesmanship.
Well, Hunter, thanks so much for joining us today on Radio Free Acton. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. We're looking forward very much to hosting you up here on November 15th, where you'll hear more at the Acton Lecture Series on the need for Christian statesmanship.
What does Jerusalem have to do with Washington, D.C.? How should we understand the connection between Christian faith and American liberalism? Some say it's a necessary antagonistic relationship. Others that it's a fruitful partnership that has been orchestrated by God himself. And still others say that it's a relationship in tension, bearing both good and bad fruit. While this question has been with us since the beginning of the American political experiment, our current cultural season seems especially fraught with difficulty and division with regard to how to think about our most important identities, loyalties, and duties. With this in mind, the Faith and Democracy in America Conference will consider this question with the intent of fostering meaningful conversations about what it looks like to do justice to both God and Caesar. Join us on December 6th and 7th to hear Sam Gregg and other Acton Institute affiliates discuss faith and democracy in America at the Prince Conference Center in Grand Rapids. Register now at acton.org/events.
Hello and welcome to the culture segment of Radio Free Acton. I'm your host, Bruce Edward Walker, and today I'm talking once again with the esteemed George Nash. And today we're going to handle the 70th anniversary of the publication of a book called Ideas Have Consequences by Richard M. Weaver. Good morning, George. How are you today?
Good morning. Very well, thank you. And you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thanks for joining us once again to shed a little bit of light on a very important and substantial work that sort of seems to have maybe fallen off the end of the cultural table in the past several decades. But if you could do us a favor and tell us a little bit about Richard Weaver and as prelude to discussing the book, Ideas Have Consequences.
Yes, Richard Weaver was born in North Carolina in 1910. He died in 1963. He was an American academic who went to the University of Kentucky, graduating there in 1932, then on to a master's at Vanderbilt and a PhD ultimately at LSU. He was really in the field of English, and in 1944, I believe it was, he became an instructor and ultimately a professor at the University of Chicago. and there he taught for the remainder of his life. He taught in the College of the University of Chicago, and he was a specialist, you might say, in rhetoric and a teacher of English, but also very much a cultural critic, or became one. And that's a story that we'll probably be discussing in the next few minutes, but I hope that places him sufficiently.
Excellent. So he's very often linked with the Southern agrarians, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. He didn't start out as one. When he graduated from college early in the Depression, or from the University of Kentucky in 1932, he considered himself a socialist and thought that that was effectively the wave of the future. And it took him some time to break from his socialism, and eventually, around 1940, he had a kind of a conversion experience and returned to pondering his Southern roots as a North Carolinian, and studied under two of the 12 writers for the famous Southern Agrarian Manifesto of 1930, the book called I'll Take My Stand. And John Crow Ransom and Robert Penn Warren were therefore two of his mentors. And I think he found that he liked them better than he liked his fellow socialists. That was one thing that started him on the road to the right. So his doctoral thesis, completed in 1943 but not published until after his death, was a study of the Old South after the Civil War and how it had tried to recover from the great wounds of war. And he very much became a member of the Southern agrarian a movement, if you will, a kind of latter-day agrarian, and was close to Donald Davidson, another one of the Southern agrarian writers. So Weaver basically was, in his own thinking, part of the Southern conservative agrarian movement. It's not entirely conservative in certain respects. At the time that he came to write what became his best-known book, the one you mentioned at the start, Ideas Have Consequences.
What exactly is Ideas Have Consequences? And then we'll use that as a segue into discussing why it was relevant then and what makes it relevant today.
Yes. It was a book that he wrote in the mid-40s after moving to the University of Chicago, and it was published by the University of Chicago Press in 1948. And it has a very arresting first line. It says, he doesn't waste any words, "This is another book about the dissolution of the West." And he was trying to understand what was happening in the world that seemed so fragmented and so much in crisis in the wake of World War II. So a bit of context here. Part of the personal context for Weaver, of course, was that at the time he was writing this book, he had identified himself with the Southern agrarian view of the world, but also he had been experiencing World War II as a war which was devastating civilization, and he was not alone in thinking at the time he wrote this book that the world, the modernity seemed to be in crisis. So this book is his cultural critique of modernity and his attempt to explain how modernity arose. And he was afraid, as many were at the time, that Western civilization was declining. He was profoundly disturbed by the dropping of the atomic bomb, by other terrible atrocities and so on that had occurred under the Nazis, and then the rise of Stalin. And that was on his mind, that it looked like the West was really falling apart. So he exemplified a stream of thinking at the time, which we might call cultural pessimism, the concern that the West was not triumphant really, but was really in a crisis mode. And it was his attempt here as a fairly young English professor to try to plumb the depths of this crisis by looking for what he saw as the intellectual roots of the crisis.
Well, not only the intellectual roots of the crisis, but the spiritual roots of the crisis.
Indeed, yeah.
He comes right out and says that modern humanity is more or less characterized as moral idiocy.
Yes, I think that's on page 1. Again, he wasted no time in getting to a dramatic point, and it was one that was somewhat shocking in a good sense of the word for the readers. The book became a moderate bestseller for that kind of work, and again, that suggested that there was an audience of people thinking about the the crisis that Western civilization was experiencing. This was the period, incidentally, when Toynbee's theories of history were in great vogue, and Arnold Toynbee was on the cover, I think, of Time magazine around the time that Weaver's book was published. So this was in the air, so to speak, among intellectuals in the West.
Oh, sure. You had Oswald Spengler, and you had the modernist poets who basically, between world wars, said that World War I was the break with our cultural past and our spiritual past.
Yes, and just jumping ahead a few years, Whittaker Chambers, the famous former communist who became a conservative icon around the time that Weaver was becoming one himself, Whittaker Chambers famously said that he felt that when he broke with the communists, he was joining the losing side when he sided with the West. And he was another one of the people writing at this era in the wake of World War II and the onset of the Cold War, fearful that the West had lost its spiritual moorings.
Well, I'm going to read a couple of quick quotes and have you respond to them and show how that they are actually indicative of the work of Ideas Have Consequences at large. One of them is, such is a brief history of how knowledge passes from a means of spiritual redemption to a basis for intellectual pride. And the other is, character itself is an expression of self-control, which does not come of taking the easiest way. Where character forbids self-indulgence, transcendence still hovers around.
Yes. His basic thesis was that in the Middle Ages, going back to the 14th century, the doctrine of nominalism had taken over and had profoundly fatally weakened the belief in transcendental values and universals. It was a philosophy expounded by a religious person in a religious order, William of Occam, who died in 1349, I believe. And his argument was that what was real was the individual and the reality experienced by the individual, and that what was perceived by the intellect, or maybe this is not all Occam, but it develops into this viewpoint, that the belief in universals independent of man, higher than man, what you might call eternal verities, that those were not really true, but the reality was the sensory world, the material world, what the individual experiences. And so Platonic idealism, the sense that ideas are, in a sense, independent of our thought, that whole sense of a world outside of ourselves, and that, of course, is a religious conception, that sense was being undermined by Occam's Razor, a famous phrase that has been identified with him in his approach to trying to simplify philosophical disputes. So for Weaver, everything followed from that. If you deny anything transcending experience, then he said ultimately you deny truth. And if you deny truth, or the sense that there is an objective truth, then he said there was no escape from relativism. And from there, one just goes down through the centuries, and this is what the first chapter of his book really attempt to demonstrate. You have a kind of logical descent. In fact, the title initially that he wanted for his book was The Fearful Descent, meaning the descent from the medieval synthesis, the worldview of the High Middle Ages, a descent from Platonic idealism, and down into this sort of shrinkage of this sense of what reality is that was instigated by Occam's approach and then worked itself out over the centuries through Hobbes and many others, and leading to this world of chaos, fragmentation, and moral anarchy that he saw all around him in the wake of World War II.
Well, I'd like to say Ideas Have Consequences, that it was a book that, in my view, was somewhat premature in its burial of Western civilization, but he sort of kind of nailed the causes for the spiritual diaspora of Western culture.
Well, one thing that happened was that the book won a following, and it placed him in what we now think of as the conservative intellectual community of discourse that started to arise after World War II, and in some sense his book is one of the first manifestations of that. And he argued that universals and transcendentals were real, and that modern liberalism, for example, was so relativist, it didn't have any strong conviction of the truth about anything, that it was really leading us even deeper into this abyss. And so he hoped that by recovering our larger metaphysical vision, and he did use the word metaphysics, that the West might find a way back to the center. He didn't like to say forward or backward, but back to the center. And he said in this book that we were being driven, centrifugally, you might say, to the periphery, and people were simply losing any sense of the orderliness of their world. And he made a remark, not in Ideas Have Consequences, but in his dissertation, which, as I mentioned earlier, was not published until 1968 after he died. He had a remarkable phrase. He said, "We can will our world." And he believed that ideas have consequences. So in a sense, that was an optimistic idea, because if bad ideas have consequences, well, maybe good ideas can have consequences. And I think that was one source of his appeal to conservatives.
Right. And I think that it's very easy when one reads the first 3/4 of the book to say he was kind of a crank. He was kind of an angry man, and he was shaking his fist at the sky and saying, what hath humanity wrought upon itself. And one of the things that he says needs solving is the great stereopticon. And explain that just a little bit.
The basic metaphor is what we would call today the modern media, the all-pervasive modern media. In his time, it was the press, the movies, and radio. So this book was written before television really had become a commonplace in American life. And I think as I reread this book, as I did prior to our discussion today, I think what would Weaver make of Twitter and Facebook? I think you would probably see them and that kind of saturation media as further examples of what he was afraid was happening, that the great stereopticon, that is this mass media complex, was feeding our egoism and our immersion in sensory experience as opposed to intellectual and spiritual experiences. And it was also promoting what he called in Ideas Have Consequences a sickly metaphysical dream. I think what he meant by metaphysical dream was what we might call worldview. And this mass media complex was promoting, he said, the dogma of progress, that everything was getting better, where, of course, Weaver was arguing that it was not. And the great stereopticon, with its constant bombardment of the masses with images and sounds, the daily news and so forth, in a fragmentary form, was actually keeping people in profound ignorance, not just in a casual sense, but more ignorant of the spiritual orderliness that they needed. And consequently, part of the problem of the great stereopticon was that it was a form of technology which was having this effect of just overwhelming us with sensory perception and sort of imprisoning us in that kind of world of sense, and making what he called disseminating wisdom more difficult. So this kind of stream of sensation, to use another of his phrases in the book, was really an obstacle to trying to turn things around. So I suspect that if he were living right now, he would be alarmed, as indeed many contemporary observers are, by the pervasiveness now of the mass media and the fragmentation that seems to be coming with it.
Oh, I think he would be absolutely mortified.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just close out with your final thoughts on the book's relevancy for today.
Yes, well, the book had a profound influence on conservatives in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even beyond. It's not referenced so much today, but there are certain items in it that I think still resonate. For example, the very title. It's not one that he particularly liked, but it did convey a certain truth, that ideas have consequences, that intellectual and spiritual issues matter, that worldview matters. And it's become something of a cliche among conservatives who perhaps are not reading the book with all that much regularity anymore. Nevertheless, it is something he bequeathed to conservatives, a sense that there was more to conservatism, more to the good things of life than simply arguing about the income tax rate or material issues. And he elevated conservative discourse in some ways permanently from simply concerning themselves with matters of economics and politics. Also, he placed great stress on private property as one way to make a stand against this constant fragmentation that he was so disturbed by. Not private property in the sense of finance capitalism or big business, but really what you own, and is a kind of a way of taking your stand and having a private sphere or a sphere of order outside the world around you. And he was very much a Southern agrarian in that respect, because the Southern agrarians believed in small property diffusion of ownership as one way to help preserve a society that might be losing its moorings. So that gave conservatives a form of argument that they didn't always have, and put it on a higher plane. And finally, I think that Richard Weaver was a man who stood his ground and a man of courage, and therefore a role model. So when people do not always agree with what he says, but they would find him a man to be admired and respected. So to some extent, his personal witness still remains.
Well, George Nash, thank you so much for this delightful and enlightening conversation on Richard M. Weaver. And for Radio Free Acton, I am your host, Bruce Walker, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to reach our podcast team here at Acton, you can email us at rfa@acton.org or leave us a message at 888-705-4180. Let us know what you think of the show and what you'd like to hear more of. Lastly, if you like what you hear on Radio Free Acton, don't forget to swing over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. This episode is produced by me, Caroline Roberts, with audio mixing by Nathan Moore.